Stefan, can I start with you? Could you give me your appreciation, your assessment of the latest state of conflicts in Ukraine?
Well, I think there are two different developments that we need to consider. One is the quite remarkable success that Ukraine has had over the past, I would say, 6 to 8 weeks in pushing Russian forces back, certainly in the north around Kharkiv, and to a smaller extent in the south and along the center of the front line in Donbass and the Kherson regions. And the other development that we have seen over the last 2 days, I would argue, is the significant escalation that President Putin has put against that by announcing a partial mobilization of more forces across Russia, and by calling these referenda in the currently occupied regions of Ukraine.
Yeah, there are clearly significant developments, and Rupert, the fighting is still pretty fierce. And we're seeing attacks on civilians increasingly now, aren't we? Zaporizhia and Melitopol. And I guess that's going to be a feature of the fighting now, isn't it? And a mark of Russian desperation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen the Russians' total disregard for human life throughout the conflict to date, and we're seeing that again. I think it is interesting because the Ukrainians continue to have the initiative on the battlefield. There's no question about that, and they continue to not appear to have any tactical plays in their arsenal, which it seems to me is one of the reasons why President Putin has made the statements he has made. He's trying to change the narrative, and it would seem to me he's probably aligned it deliberately with the UN General Assembly meeting. Yes. Whether that works well for him, time will tell.
Stefan, what about the casualties and the losses in this war? Ukraine's armed forces, they've now published a figure of 55,510 personnel lost since the start of the invasion. Now, your thought on that, and also on Russian losses, because we know it's likely that there's a certain amount of distortion, isn't there, when it comes to these publications of figures?
Well, I think the human losses on both sides are quite significant, and I think that has consequences in two ways. On the one hand, I think there is the issue: how much does Russia actually have left in terms of both troops, but also in terms of the equipment that it can give to these troops? So mobilizing 300,000 new soldiers or reservists, as Putin has said, that doesn't necessarily equip them with the material that they would need in order to resist the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Yeah. And on the Ukrainian side, I mean, it's the losses in troops, but also the sheer human cost that the country has endured in terms of civilian casualties, internally displaced persons, and refugees, which, I mean, these last two categories number around 7 million people, which is roughly a sixth of Ukraine's total population.
Yeah, I mean, no one believes Russia's official figures for losses. Otherwise, why would they be contemplating a general mobilization, Stefan? And now we're seeing, well, pretty clear evidence. It's on our social media feeds almost every hour of demonstrations against the mobilization in Russia. I mean, how difficult will that be? Will that step be to accomplish, given the inbuilt resistance to it within the Russian population?
Well, I think we have to be careful here in terms of how much we project from events in the major Russian urban centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg, yeah, to the rest of the country. I mean, Russia is a country with, roughly 140 or so million people. I mean, the level of protest in a very tightly controlled, very autocratic society, I mean, it's not going to be that big, and the opportunities that people will have to actually resist en masse against the mobilization, I think, will also be quite limited. So I would not overstate that. I mean, we are not going to see mass mobilization here and a color revolution in Russia at the moment.
That's an important qualification. And Rupert, even when it comes to those who are successfully pushed into the front line on the Russian side, all sorts of interesting reports that convicts are being taken out of prison. They're being thrown into battle. Some of them immediately surrendering. The threat of protesters in Russia, these protesters we're discussing, being sent to the front line as a kind of a punishment. And no doubt they're, in many cases, are going to be looking for a way to cross out and get out of the fighting, maybe surrender as soon as possible. And they're not going to, they may be reinforcing their military in numbers, Rupert, but not necessarily in strength, on a commensurate level.
Absolutely right. I mean, it doesn't half smell of desperation. It doesn't exactly feel like a strategy born of having the initiative. As you say, all sorts of waifs and strays, convicts being thrown into the fight, and as you say, I mean, there's a figure being thrown around of about 300,000 being mobilised. I mean, it's an entirely academic figure, because they have to be formed into units. We've heard they've got to be equipped, and we know the Russians don't have the equipment. But critically, yes, they are reservists. They've got some military training, but you cannot throw them into a fight like Ukraine and expect them to survive without some additional training. And they don't have the wherewithal to train numbers at that scale, and they don't have the leaders, the officers, with the experience to come back out of the line to train them. So I mean, the whole thing is pretty ill-conceived. And, at best, from a Russian perspective, they can push cannon fodder, it's a horrible term, but cannon fodder into the fight. They will get short shrift from the Ukrainians. And all of this is telling us the Ukrainians have a continuing window to keep the pressure on the Russians.
Right. And speaking of pressure then, Stefan, after Vladimir Putin's threats yesterday, that bit of nuclear saber rattling, telling us that he has weapons and he's not bluffing, he's prepared to use them. What is the appropriate response of the West to that, beyond carrying on doing what the West is doing?
No, I think the West really needs to keep on doing what it has been doing so far, because it's not the first time that Putin has thrown out this kind of red line, and all the red lines that he has drawn in the past, they were pretty inconsequential. So I think from that perspective, it's really important to make sure that the pressure is being kept up. I think part of the question for me is, how long can Ukrainian society sustain that? I mean, it's not just a question of giving them the political, the economic, the military backing, but it's also how resilient a society can remain after 7 months of very fierce fighting and very severe losses that they have incurred.